and that they will share with the legislature. And I think if you need, they have to be able to issue certain orders to create that plan and to make it available. That should be their prerogative. But to implement any parts of that plan by order without the legislature, the plan to implement the plan itself without the legislature having gone through LCAR, I would think was a totally different matter and should not be permitted. And that was the reason I brought it up. And the committee would just speak the best to try and answer that, but that's my opinion.
We're getting emails that our audio isn't working. It is now?
It is.
Great, thank you.
We're going to get about 10.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
Hope we don't put this
Thank
to
you.
rest until we understand that bifurcation and reach a decision.
Okay, so let's keep working and we will see how you can fill us in how you've edited. Well, actually, why don't we address that question? So for the implementation, is it by rule?
Yes, section 3 of the bill, based on, from yesterday's draft, says that they need to implement the clean heat standard with a rule.
May have been redundant in my remarks, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
So we're on draft 3.1. We're still on page 3, but I do want to reiterate that throughout the bill, including elsewhere on page 3, there is the reference to by rule or order the commission shall do something. So that flexibility is throughout the statute. However, in the implementation section at the end, there's a clear directive that it has to be through rulemaking. So you may want to consider if that flexibility needs to be removed from the statute.
Well, I think, so once the process, once there's an implementation, and I think that's when there is an interest on the part of many people to see the legislature consider what the program would look like prior to it becoming live. And so it's that last step, maybe, that, you know, the implementation phase that I think we want to have by rule, so we're certain that it can LCAR and the legislature gets back in the legislature's court ceremony.
Is there anything in the text or maybe in the background law that would clarify when to use orders and when to promulgate rules?
No.
So the rules are simpler than the orders are simpler than the rules, right? The simpler, you just do it. So someone could just decide, if they don't want to go through the trouble of rules, just doing everything by order.
If we were to give them such authority.
Well, I think that we do, and that's what this language says.
Yes, with the exception of at the end of the bill, it is a clear directive that the initial implementation has to be by rule.
The initial implementation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so are we set on that for now? Come back to it if we need to. Thank you.
So the next change is on page 8. At the bottom of page 8, this is the section on equitable distribution of clean heat credits and the emphasis on low income and moderate income customers. This is language that was proposed yesterday. So starting on line 19, it's adding additional language. So in determining whether to exceed the minimum percentages of clean heat measures that must be delivered to low and moderate income customers, the commission shall take into account participation in other government-sponsored low income and moderate income weatherization programs. So you will recall that farther up on this page, there's a directive that at least 16% of credits needs to come from low income customers and 16% needs to come from moderate income customers. The commission also has the ability to adjust these percentages. So this is adding language that says in determining whether to exceed the minimum percentages of 16 and 16, the commission shall take into account participation in other government weatherization program.
And my, understanding of that one was if there are multiple incentives offloading into supporting a particular population, they should be aware of the context of other things that would influence what would happen to the community program. Thank you.
Wait a minute, does that mean we give credit for stuff that was already happening anyway?
No, so actually, I think this language, I think yesterday when you heard from Mr. Duval on this language, there was intent that if the government-sponsored weatherization programs are available to 40% of customers, that may be something to consider when setting the threshold of who is in the low-income category. Should there be a higher percentage of low-income credits required because there is a larger population of people who are already taking advantage of other subsidies?
All right, thank you.
At the bottom of page 11, there is another small change related to that first issue we were discussing about after the adoption of the rules implementing the chapter. Previously, that was the order implementing this chapter. And the same change is made on page 12. And so this is the section that is on the annual reports that are required from the PUC every year. So on page 12, it just says on or before August 31st of each year, following the year in which the rules are first adopted under this section, the PUC shall submit reports to the standing committees. And so that's also just a reminder that at the end of this bill, there are these check it back reports that are fairly detailed, and I'll show you the language in a moment, but there are also annual reports required from the PUC after the adoption of the clean heat standard every year.
Thank you.
The next change is on page 13. This is language you have discussed before. And it is on the calculation for life cycle emissions. So this is the section on clean heat credits. So at the top of page 13, clean heat credits shall be based on the life cycle CO2e emission reductions that result from the delivery of eligible clean heat measures to end use customer locations into or in Vermont. For clean heat measures that are installed, the value of the clean heat credits in each year shall be the life cycle CO2e emissions of the heating fuel avoided by the installation of the measure minus the life cycle CO2e emissions of the energy that is used instead.
Makes sense.
That's our apples to,
What?
that's our apples to apples.
Yeah.
Math.
Thank you.
Next on page 15. So we're still in the section on clean heat credits. Again, this is recommendation from yesterday's presentation. So subdivision 3, the commission shall determine whether to require a certain portion of clean heat credits be acquired each year from weatherization projects in order to further the state's building efficiency goals. The commission shall recommend legislative changes if needed to accomplish this. So currently, the only requirement is that obligated parties each year retire the required number of credits while meeting the 16% for income, low income, and 16% for moderate income. It does not dictate which measures those credits need to come from. So this is adding language to directing the PUC to determine if a certain percentage needs to come from weatherization projects.
Yeah, on the editorial side, I'd say that part of the program is that it's entirely flexible in terms of what measures you select in order to participate. And the same time, people have been concerned about, are we going to lose focus on the importance of weatherization? Given that we're moving a record $80 million into weatherization and stepping up our weatherization for all, weatherization at scale program, I don't share that concern right now. And but this is just sort of a reminder to ask them to keep an eye on weatherization, because we also don't want to end up in a place somewhere down the road where we're doing less weatherization, and then we're just heating the rate outdoors more efficiently. So a useful reminder. Thank you.
Okay, so the next change is on page 21. This was not a recommendation from yesterday's presentation. Mr. Chair, do you want to introduce it, or do you want me to read it first?
I gotta catch up to your highlights.
Sure. Page 21 is adding a new section to the Clean Heat Standard statute, the chapter. It's adding a new section on legislative intent.
So that ultimately, you know, we've heard concerns from the administration about having some sort of, and members of the General Assembly as well. I want to just lay it on the administration that we should have some sort of mechanism for the legislature to look at the process, at the program as it evolves, and just see what the fiscal impact would be, for instance, or impact on costs. And that seems prudent. The question is, how do we do it? I think what's, to me, seems objectionable in the suggestion from the administration is their suggestion names both the form of the question and the method by which we ask it to ourselves and affirm it, and which seems like, quite frankly, executive overreach. I think the question's valid. We're accepting the question, but I think we should determine how we ask ourselves that question. We can go on the record responding to it on our own. So, because part of the answer, I think, may lie in using LCAR, so we're shifting to rules. The final bill of the final rule will show us the program. LCAR will be responding to that. LCAR will be in the position of asking itself, does this rule meet legislative intent? And rather than have LCAR in the somewhat unenviable position of trying to figure out what legislative intent was from the bill, I thought it'd be helpful to future members of LCAR if we were explicit about that, so that they can evaluate the rule as it comes through using this as their test. So
I'm going to read the language. I want to point out that none of this is new language. I moved language from other parts of the statute into this. So this is existing language. So it is the intent of the General Assembly that the Clean Heat Standard be designed and implemented in a manner that achieves Vermont's thermal sector greenhouse gas emissions reductions necessary to meet the requirements of 10 VSA 587A, the Global Warming Solutions Act, minimizes costs to customers, and recognizes that affordable heating is essential for Vermonters. It shall minimize adverse impacts on low income and moderate income customers and those households with the highest energy burdens. So you may want to consider if that captures all of the intent, or if there's anything in there that shouldn't be included.
Is it a loophole? Something that will reduce our contribution of atmospheric carbon? We should do it, and they say, yeah, but it'll cost, therefore we shouldn't.
Well, so I don't know if you have a response to that.
So the first element of it is reduce greenhouse gas emissions necessary to meet the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act.
So
Then,
that's there first.
then it minimizes costs. and affordable heating. Then it also recognizes minimizing costs to impacts to low and moderate income customers.
So that is the context.
So I think that. Okay, for now,
Yeah,
that it's good that we're using existing language, but pulling it together in one spot. Labeling it clearly is intent. So I don't know if people want, I don't want to rush.
I think politically this is important because this is the opposition we're hearing from out there in the world is that we're being insensitive to the economic problems of low and moderate income people.
By doing nothing, we're insensitive
no,
to the.
I'm not making the point. I'm saying that's what I'm hearing. That's what we're answering. That's the attitude we're trying to address.
Yes. And, also just to assist a future LCAR committee in terms of what metric are they going to use as they read the rule and assess whether they can. Okay. Thank you. If people have questions about it, want to discuss more, we'll come back. Let's just keep going on the walkthrough.
Great, so there's only two other changes. So the next is on page 22. And this was the discussion that this committee had yesterday, and just about clarifying about the public meetings. So the commission shall hold at least 6 public meetings, and of those meetings, 3 shall allow members of the public to participate in person and remotely. The meeting shall be held in at least 6 different geographically diverse counties of the state. So I did attempt to capture your concerns there.
Okay. Can we say excluding Bennington?
Say it again?
Is that where we would insert excluding Bennington County? Thank you.
Yeah, I've never understood that the 3 that aren't all government meetings supposed to be open to the public?
Yes. Well, public meetings are open to the public, yes.
Yeah, so why are we saying 3 of these? Why not all
No, but the 3 are for hybrid,
In
so
person.
in person and remote.
of them? Oh, okay, and the others may not have the remote,
Yeah,
but if you can get there, which is all you had until recently.
yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, the House had recommended, originally it was all 6 had to be hybrid meetings. The PUC requested that only 1 be hybrid. And so this is
Yeah,
a compromise.
okay.
All right, so finally, there are changes on page 25, based on yesterday's conversation, to the check back reports. So before I walk through the changes, I want to point something out quickly. At the bottom of page 24, there is an additional report that's required from the PUC on January 15th, 2023. It's where they report back on how they recommend that this program be funded. Because this bill only provides one-time funding, they are supposed to report back next January on revenue streams that can be used. So on page 25, in the last draft, you adjusted the date of the other report to be February 15th, 2023, and then January 15th, 2024. These 2 things aren't inherently in conflict, but that's just as a reminder that they'll now have 2 reports due next winter, not on the same day.
I think I would want to check with the PUC. I know that we received an email from council, Kyle Landis Marinello, about PUC concerns. I think I want to hear from them about, I know that rulemaking has an impact on the program overall because of all the public outreach that would have to occur before rulemaking commenced. And so if I don't want us to ask them to take on tasks that they don't feel like they're set up in terms of the timeline to succeed at. So I want to hear from the PUC either directly or we'll get more feedback on this draft. So this report, let me check in with you, Ms. Chakowski. The question that comes to mind immediately when I read about by January 15, 2023, they're going to have a report on funding. It's so early in the development of the program, I'm not sure how they would have. That seems like one of the a relatively mature question to ask when you're developing a program is how, if you haven't completed the design of it, then how would you know how you would fund it? Although they have already delivered reports previously citing different sources of funding, but not for this particular program. I think I'd want to know more before we ask. Were you bringing this up first to make us not just aware, but to suggest we might consider changing that date?
No, I just wanted to point out that in the version as passed by the House,
Yeah.
there was a very short section H on this funding report, and section I was also pretty short. But now subsection I is quite long in the
Right.
number of items that are required in the report. So I just want you to be aware. I do think these are, I think they are separate issues.
Yeah.
The PUC is receiving $600,000 in this bill for the first year of this implementation. So at the very least, they have a rough estimate that they are not going to be getting $600,000 next year. So they are getting new staff positions.
Yeah.
So they will have a rough estimate, at least on the staffing needs for that they'll need to make up with the funding source. So.
Okay. Well, I think we know that the total development time is roughly 2.5 years, right? And that the information will get more complete as they work through it. So, and we have the benefit of 2 years of reports, 23 and 24. Okay, thank you for that. All right, so we didn't walk.
Great, so now on
Yeah.
page 25, there's new language based from yesterday's recommendations. So the check back reports. On or before February 15th, 2023 and January 15th, 2024, the commission shall submit a written report to and hold hearings with the House Committees on Energy and Technology and on Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife, and the Senate Committees on Finance and Natural Resources and Energy, detailing the efforts undertaken to establish the clean heat standard. The reports shall include, to the extent available, estimates of the impacts of the clean heat standard on customers, including impacts on customer rates and fuel bills for participating and non-participating customers, net impacts on total spending on energy for thermal sector end uses, fossil fuel reductions, greenhouse gas emission reductions, and if possible, impacts on economic activity and employment. In conducting this analysis, the PUC shall incorporate the social cost of carbon as established by the Vermont Climate Council, take into account the economic modeling conducted in the Vermont Pathways Analysis, and consider the potential costs of delaying action to achieve the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. The modeled impacts shall estimate high, medium, and low price impacts. The reports shall recommend any legislative action needed to address enforcement of the clean heat standard. And then on to page 26. Based on the information regarding projected costs and benefits, the PUC shall recommend cost containment mechanisms to be included in statute. Upon receiving the recommendations regarding cost containment mechanisms provided by the PUC, The General Assembly shall determine whether to enact legislation adopting the commission's recommendations. So,
So this is not what we started to talk about, the LCAR mechanism or whatever, but anyways. Clear it out.
This is, if it is, something is necessary to implement, carry out, and enforce by rule the clean heat standards, it ought to be in the darn rule. Should it not?
are you referring to the last line of page 25? What are you?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Our rule failed to include the following? Or is that what the recommendation would be? That we didn't include this necessary provision?
so yesterday you heard testimony
Yep.
that you may want to consider requiring enforcement by agencies beyond the PUC. That, however, is not currently addressed in the statute.
So that my anecdotal way of saying was, Mr. Coda said that enforcement could be difficult and that it was key to making the program a success. So
The rule wouldn't say you can't bring stuff in from New Hampshire and pump it into people's tanks unless you do X, Y, or Z. It wouldn't say that.
well, that I see what you're saying now. In part because I was feeling like we don't have the time to go into a whole thing on how we will craft enforcement provisions that we would ask in the report. They might well write such a thing. There's nothing precluding them from writing enforcement provisions, but it may require statutory changes in order to fully implement enforcement. So the report comes back with a recommendation related to any legislative action needed to address enforcement of the clean heat standard. And a subsequent legislature picks up that topic, looks into it, and writes a new law to be able to implement. That's the concept. It's
If
not,
that's a concept,
yeah, I mean, it's not.
maybe it could be,
It's not assuming that we'll just ask for a report one, well, it's actually a report twice over, and do nothing. It's hard to become more aware of it.
when LCAR has a rule that does not appear to, it seems to have something left out, we send letters to the committees of jurisdiction saying, you might want to clear this up.
Yeah. And, but this isn't the check back report, so this is well before the rule ever comes to LCAR. So this gives us a heads up next January, or February, and the following January. And I'm guessing, so let me check with council. If you were alluding to the fact that the piece that Mr. Coda was saying, that agencies outside of the PUC might well need to be involved in an enforcement program. So that would require statutory change, is that correct?
Potentially.
Potentially.
You ought to show up at the hearings, say that, and Mr. Coda is correct, that there ought to be enforcement. And one would think that the rules would cover enforcement when Mr. Coda came in and brought them up. So I'm not saying that that's what's supposed to happen. So these are provisions in the case something that was supposed to happen doesn't happen.
Exactly. And I would say this was my request to council because it was brought up. It seemed like a potentially serious flaw, but that the bill as crafted didn't necessarily address enforcement across multiple agencies. So rather than have to sort that out now, acknowledge the need to address it, build it into the report, and give the next legislature the chance to write that law.
The law that, the Global Warming Solutions Act we passed includes a right of action for citizens against the state if the state fails to implement the law. With LCAR, if I remember right from when I served on LCAR, LCAR does not reject the rule, but if LCAR does not accept the rule, then the administration loses the presumption of administrative discretion in subsequent lawsuits.
We either
So-
approve, we don't disapprove,
Right.
or we fail to approve.
If you fail to approve, then the administration no longer enjoys a presumption of administrative discretion in case of a lawsuit.
Yes.
So the reference to the Rules Committee is no small thing.
So, right, the rules failed to provide enforcement
Yeah, yeah.
methods. And the rules, the LCAR said, hey, you guys messed this up. You didn't include this. The administration can implement it anyway, and then it would, someone could go to court and say, wait a minute, you didn't give the police the right to, or the so-and-so's the right to pull the trucks over and inspect their books. They're bringing in stuff from out of
And
state.
the burden of proof shifts to the state.
And
Usually the burden of proof will be.
And they-
plaintiff.
And it is more likely that the demand that happen.
Yeah.
So I'm not objecting to the language, talking a lot, trying to think it through.
I'm thinking it's good
You're
language.
right, the drafter has done what been asked to do.
Yeah,
And,
Gratefully.
and I requested it as a visible, sort of actionable placeholder for the conference, knowing that we haven't solved it, but that we are acknowledging that we'll need to figure this out. We have 2.5 years to do so.
this does not dispose of the fox guarding the hen house characterization, but it mitigates it. I think it mitigates. This is a protection against the fox.
I did want to raise one separate issue
Yeah.
that you've already alluded to. So that language at the end about, based on information, the PUC shall make cost containment mechanism recommendations and the General Assembly shall determine whether to act on those recommendations. Because the intro language on page 25 is that there are 2 reports, I do think that means that action on cost containment will happen twice.
Right.
Unless you want to pick a specific year for that aspect to happen.
Well, let's think about it as a group. I think the concern we've heard was that they wanted to have I know that people want it at the beginning of next session, because some people said, if it's too expensive, stop right then and there. I get that one. I don't know if we would want to have the same check-in at year 2. I don't see a downside. For instance, 3 simply says we determine whether we're going to enact legislation. That's my thinking is we're probably going to enact, each report will trigger some new lawmaking as the program matures. Like maybe we need some new lawmaking, a new variety of, some new variety of cost containment measure, or maybe we need to do some new law on enforcement. So given that 3 is entirely permissive, shall determine whether to enact legislation without recommendations. I don't see a downside to acknowledging that actually, it seems like a plus to me now that I'm thinking about it out loud with you. It means that we're gonna pay attention to the reports and consider whether or not we need to make adjustments.
And then any economic analysis, any cost analysis, um, has to include, and I think it does, I'm just asking if in fact we've achieved this, has to include a comparison to the cost of not doing it.
That's in
You know,
page
We did talk a
25.
little bit about that yesterday, yeah.
The,
it is interesting, the kind of right-wing opposition I'm getting constantly talks about how much this is gonna cost. You haven't taken into account how much this is gonna cost. And I realize, to have no plan is itself a plan. That plan is let things continue as they are. And my answer is, that's too expensive a plan.
but I think
Letting things continue is too expensive.
your point is in the new language in lines 17 and 18 on page 25, that report shall consider the potential cost of delaying action to achieve the requirement.
I noticed, and I think on first glance that's good, and that's enough. I'm just checking myself here. Everyone think that's enough?
The top of page 26 too, there was also the addition of, based on the information regarding potential costs and benefits of the program. So it did add and benefits of the program to that.
Great, so thank you so much for turning around another draft, pulling all these things together. I think the area of work that I'd like to consider with the committee is the notion of how the General Assembly might interact with the rulemaking without disrupting the APA before the program went live. So we would, at some point, the rules coming back, goes to LCAR. In what is there an elegant solution to having the General Assembly evaluate the work once LCAR's finished its task?
They always do once LCAR's, when the process is over, and often they intervene for things that have come up during the rulemaking. It's normal.
Senator Campion?
What does that get us, would you say, at this point, given that we're hearing that there are some in the pavilion that are going to stop this, and does it get us something?
Well, I think.
I'm just trying to understand,
Sure, I think.
because also I feel like, to be honest, the longer we wait on this, more people are going to be in with, hey, what about that comma there, and getting a little bit. If you said, oh gosh, the governor will sign it with that, I'd say, oh, but we're only hearing otherwise.
Right.
And so I think it's time personally,
Yeah.
but I respect your commitment to it. And
Okay.
Did you plan to vote on this in the morning?
Right, so the goal is to vote this out tomorrow. So I think we have a clean draft. The question is whether or not we want to consider any further adjustments. But at this point, feeling like we've got a lot of checking in, a lot of rebalancing. And yeah, so I'm content. I'm content with where they are. Your point.
I mean,
It's right.
Right. Why add, I guess there's two schools of thought. One would be, I can imagine further provisions that might persuade people that we're being completely thorough and diligent in our review of the rule. And you could do that in more than one way. Or you could say, well, we have plenty going on already, 2 years worth of check back reports with potential legislation to follow. And that's.
Yeah, as an analogy, years ago, I was doing an album, and it was right near the end of the mix down, like the album was done. And I said, I've rethought that second song. And the producer said, take that talent and insight and critique and save it for your next album. This album is fine.
Shouting's done, okay.
Well said.
On the agenda.
So we'll wait,
And was it a hit?
there's no way to
I never had
we
it.
haven't scheduled that vote in yet, but we will.
It was a
we're gonna be
cult.
Moving
Oh, yeah.
on.
I had a cold.
All right, so thank you, everyone. We are adjourned.
10 minutes early.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
You're welcome.